on time. So just to start with welcoming you, saying thanks that you spent some time joining this year. When we launched the Academy last year, our idea was to take a look at global trends and popular movements. We were also tackling some of the most important battlefields of today, where we are talking about democracy. We were looking obviously at the pandemic and some other issues, and we figured out it's a great way to connect people. It's a great way to bring in the discussion. We hope we are going to repeat the experience from last year and digging more into what may be the most important trends and topics of the global activism this year. As last year, we are going to look at the 4 sessions over the course of the 2 weeks, and we were looking at what may be more interesting and where the world is going and how these popular movements are emerging and what the governments are doing. So obviously, we are starting with a global overview on something we call democracy under siege, where we are looking at the year of pandemic, where we are looking at the trends of coups, where we are looking at abuse of power. We are going to discuss where the world is from the point of democracy today with some of our distinguished panelists that I'm going to introduce in a few minutes. We are moving into the bleak present, greener future, the world of probably, at least for me, most important movement of nowadays, which is the movement for saving our planet, for climate change. Obviously, we had a very interesting 2019. We had things happening in 2020. We have shifts from top to bottom, with shifts in government. We have shifts from bottom up when you take a look at how the movements are emerging across the world. And we're going to follow this trend of global decentralized movements through the world of environment this coming Thursday, same time. We'll be moving to a little bit of a phenomenon that obsessed us all. If you haven't wrote the word echo chamber, fake news, anti-vaxxers in the last few weeks, I can buy you a drink. Obviously, it's pretty common and it shapes our reality in a really interesting way. How it impacts our thinking, how it impacts global campaigns, and also how the power of social media gives movements like Me Too leverage to spread and act locally, where the idea is coming from one source or this is a global organization. We will end up with a kind of workshop and very practical presentations on how you can stay safe in the world of digital surveillance and trolling. And this is our next Thursday session, will be on digital space and digital security. What are the threats for activists? What are the potentials? How you can use tools like Bitcoin to fundraise for places like Belarus. All of this will be covered by experts, and we are absolutely super thrilled that we have such a tremendously wonderful people, far more clever and experienced than we are, that are helping us in this. So welcome to our session number 1. I'll first explain the pace of session. I will guide you through the topics and principles we want to talk about, and chat will be your space for all the time. We'll be reaching through the certain topics we want to touch. We're going to take a look at how the global pandemic has created fertile grounds for autocratic tendencies globally. We're going to look at the data and the global democracy backlash. We're going to see the rise of a completely new breed of pro-democracy movement, how they differed from movements in the past, how they spread differently, how they are more difficult to oppress and more difficult to manage by the organizers. Also, we're going to take a look at a big game that happened in the United States with one president leaving, another president coming, how it impacts the world as we consider this a kind of a very influential place, how the events from January 6th influenced the US and the world. And we're going to look at the recent trends of coups and what we consider very important battle of actual reality, which happens in Myanmar. Basically, starting with a very bleak picture, what we know if you read data, what we know if you read news, or if we are more digging into the substance and take a look at the World Democracy Index from Freedom House, World Prosperity Index from Legatum Institute, global democracy is on the decline. Where this is impacted by the pandemic world, in which it's so easy and so legal to cut the restrictions on public gathering, to cut people freedoms, to legalize face recognition cameras, where this is the abuse of power of certain leaders, including some European leaders, taking a look at how they can use this opportunity to shrink social space even more. Whatever it is, we are now, since early 90s, for the first time living in a place where majority, 54% of the global population lives in non-free countries. We are talking about the 92 different countries are living in the place where they are either leaning to autocracy or they are already autocratic. What is really interesting and bizarre, and we will touch with our first panelist, Anne Applebaum, is how this is not actually coming because the Kim Jong-uns of this world are becoming more effective in suppressing people. This global democracy decline comes most from the countries that we consider partly or completely democratic in the past, places like United States, Brazil, India, or Turkey, where we had democratically elected leaders who are doing the assault on democracy from the top bottom. Speaking on the other side of the spectrum, it is obvious that we have a glimpse of hope. We have Ben Press, who is going to dig us into the world of protests in 2019, 2020. Obviously, we see the new breed of movements happening across the globe that he's going to explain a little bit more. Obviously, we are looking into the tide of the environmental movements, which in certain countries become increasingly political, increasingly fast, and whether we are expecting the post-COVID shake. What will happen when the bill for awful handling of pandemic comes due, and how this will impact elections in places like US, we obviously have seen that, or actual status of autocratic governments, another trend that we are witnessing in Belarus, where it wasn't for the COVID, we probably wouldn't have the large post-electoral crisis. There have been flawed elections before in Belarus, but now it's obviously a very different game. That shades the lights on the two battlefields. One I mentioned is Belarus, another one is Myanmar, where after years of gradual opening and free and fair elections, some people in the military decided that the toy called democracy that they offer to the people is not something they are very comfortable with, and came back to the 1988 scenario in which military grabs it all. Surprisingly for them, decapitating the main actually ruling party, NLD, was not enough. The country is in a different states of turmoil, non-cooperation, non-recognizing the new power grab. And despite the rising level of violence, people seems to persist and find a way to delegitimize the power grabbers. We're going to have distinguished guest who knows far more about what's happening in Burma than myself, and a stray of very powerful images that are going to inspire you. Of course, needless to say, January the 6th was the event we couldn't expect. If only I was given a dime when some of my American friends were calling me and said, "What do you see?" And I see a lousy attempt of a coup. And this is where we are now. We are looking at a place where years of fake news, the years of propaganda actually try to undermine the very basics of American democracy, and that ended up ugly. And talking about how this impacts the world is really, really important, especially when we are witnessing the new approach to the world democracy in recent G7 summit. So without further ado, the question of all questions, and as we spoke last year, is where are we going from now? Where are we going with people power? Where are we going with democracy? Where we're going with the shape of the movements? Where we are going with the global politics? And what can we expect as the COVID is not going to be excuse for blocking things in the year to come. Today with us, two Pulitzer winning award ladies, starting with Anne Applebaum, journalist, prize-winning, best-selling actor, senior fellow at the Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. After her, my biggest refreshment from last year, the person who passionately tracks protests across the globe, Ben Press, James G. Gettler Jr. Fellow at Democracy, Conflict, and Governance Program in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Really great view on movement. Today with us, another Top Gun journalist and a people I call a dear friend and someone, sometimes when in a mood, my New York aunt, Tina Rosenberg, co-founder of the Solution Journalism Network and writer of the New York Times Fixes columns. And as a strawberry on a cake, speaking about Burma, the brave and heroic Kada Chai, somebody who knows what's happening and helps activists across the Myanmar in this distinctive moment. So without further ado, I'm going to kill the screen share so we can see each other a little bit more and explain how this is going to work. We're going to go panelist by panelist. And as you're listening or you're thinking about the topic, please feel free to ask questions for Anne Applebaum or myself in a chat. And after she's done, we're going to go through these questions and try to answer them. Then we move to Ben and then to Tina and then to Ada. So feel free to write things in the chat. The chat is going to be the channel of communication we are going to use most. So Anne, first of all, thank you for participating. Glad to have you today. I always like to pick your brains where the heck the world is in terms of democracy and where you think we are going.
Well, so first of all, thank you for that nice, easy question, which, nobody has any difficulty answering. Look, I mean, your introduction showed, pointed out the stark truth, which is that democracy as a system, whereas it felt 20 years ago, like more countries were heading in that direction, we're now heading in a different direction. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. I mean, I was joking about it being an easy question, but it's, but it's easy to answer with a few brief things that will be a little bit superficial. But I'll do my best. I mean, one of the there are domestic answers, there are economic answers, there are, I would say, psychological answers, and then there are kind of foreign policy competition answers. Certainly in the democracy, in the historic democracies, so Europe, the United States, and the democracies of Asia, which have been which have been tightly linked by alliances and trade and so on for the last 50 years, beginning with the financial crisis, and then continuing through, I think, partly thanks to the internet, the information revolution. You can see in almost all of these countries some kind of loss of confidence, some loss of certainty that we know what we're doing, that our experts are in charge, that our people are making good decisions. And that's very hard to, there's a slightly different version of that in each country, but the loss of certainty that we are the best and we know what we're doing and we know where we're going has had a huge impact on people's faith in their own politics and their own political systems. I mean, that's you could delve into that, as I said, in greater detail in a lot of different places. That, I would say, has also been augmented by the rise of the autocracies. So whether it's China's gain in economic power and influence, whether it's Russia's successful use of its particular form of propaganda and disinformation. It's where, Russia has learned how to use it inside different democracies. It did so very successfully in the United States in 2016, but previous to that, it had done it in Ukraine and Poland, but also in Germany, France. So the rise of the power of the autocracies and the autocracies' interest in influencing democracy, and their ability to influence democracy, which they now have thanks to the global internet as well as the global economy. So they have new channels of influence inside the democracies that they didn't used to have. So paradoxically, globalization, which was conceived by the democracies, I mean, it was really an American-led way of thinking about economics and thinking about politics in the world, has now in a way backfired, or in any case, the autocratic powers have learned how to use the global economy, whether it's through business links or through bribery or through political influence campaigns, have learned how to use it to influence the democracy. So that's the second piece of it. The third piece of it, I would say, I'm often asked, I'm very torn about how much the internet simply by itself, by which I don't just mean social media, but the transfer of so much of business, commerce, politics, relationships from the real world to online, how much of that has explains a lot of the current malaise in a lot of different areas. I mean, how much of it is different things? And I have a running, ongoing argument with a lot of my friends about the degree to which really the internet itself can be held responsible, or whether the internet is just a reflection of things that already existed and are somehow amplified by it. But certainly the nature of online conversation has changed things very drastically. And you can almost trace it from, there's a moment between kind of about 2007 and 2010, when the internet goes from being a fairly creative space where lots of people could organize in different ways online, to being very heavily dominated by 3 or 4 big platforms, by 3 or 4 big companies. And those companies then set the rules, not just for commerce, which is a whole separate conversation, but they also set the rules for how we communicate online. And they invented the liking and sharing economy. They made it advantageous for people to perform online. So if you perform, if you're angry, if you're divisive, if you play a very emotional role online, you get more attraction, more likes, more shares, and the algorithms promote you. So the internet did begin to promote division, anger, emotion in a way, rather than consensus and civilized debate over the last decade, in a way that, again, there are different views about how important it was, but it certainly affected other media. I mean, most journalists are on Twitter. They're affected by the conversations that take place there. They then, so even mainstream media was affected by this really profound change in the way that people spoke. We can talk a bit more about that if you want. And finally, I would say that the internet is also, together with other kinds of technological change, is also responsible for something else, which is this really rapid moment of economic and demographic and other kinds of change. So, and it's not a myth. If you're now 50 years old in the United States, or in France, or in India, actually, you now live in a world that is so radically different from the one that you grew up in, as to be unrecognizable. I mean, depending, again, the story is a little different in different places, but the kinds of people you're surrounded with, the kind of work that people do, maybe the kind of house that you live in, the way you get to work, what you see on television, the material culture around you is so different that it can cause people, it has created a kind of, it's almost an international nostalgia. There's a backward looking mood in so many countries about loss of traditions, loss of customs, loss of a sense of closeness with family. And this feeling of loss, I think, it's very hard to, it's hard to pinpoint, but once you start talking about it again in almost any modern democracy, you feel the sense of loss. I think this has also led to a different kind of politics. Suddenly the politics of tribalism, the politics of xenophobia, a lot of that is more appealing now than it used to be, because people feel the need to belong to some kind of homogenous community again. They feel this loss or this sense of change. And I think that the speed of change, even by itself, and the reason I point to it is this is something that's happened before. So if you look back at the history of modernization, if you look back, for example, 19th century Germany, you had a very similar moment where writers who wrote about the great heroes of the past and how marvelous they were by comparison to the petty, pygmies who run us in the present, and who began to idealize kings and emperors and other kinds of autocracies. You had this very similar moment in Germany that you now see repeating itself in the United States and in other places. And this is a common phenomenon in rapidly changing, modernizing, democratizing societies. And you now see it being repeated in a lot of, in a lot of democracies. And I think that's the other, there's a psychological element now too, the sort of longing for community, solidarity, even authoritarianism is something you can now see in a lot of different countries. So that's my brief introduction to this vast subject.
This is absolutely great. It actually coincides with the first question. I thought, should I interview you or the audience should? And the answer is always leave it to the audience. We just get the absolutely fitting question to your last point from Safa Harun, who asks, how can we turn the tables on the internet and social media and use it to amplify debate and conversation as opposed to polarizing people against each other?
So that's something I've recently written about, and I'm happy after I stop talking, I'll share the article in the chat for those of you who are interested. Peter Pomerantz, who I think is coming next week to speak about the digital world, and I wrote recently a piece in which we talked about what some of the alternatives might be. And there's, I mean, essentially, there are two different ways to think about it. One is through regulation, and this is through regulation, not by which I do not mean censorship and that there'll be a Orwellian, truth machine taking things down off Facebook, but I mean regulating the algorithms. So looking at how the looking at the engineering of the internet and what it is that gets spread and how, and shouldn't there be some social input into that in the way that there's social input into how we regulate food that we eat, and we don't allow poisons to be put in our sausages. Shouldn't there be some public input, maybe not even necessarily government input, but other alternative input into the way the algorithms work? And there is a lot of progress being made, at least scientifically, on how this could be done, how there could be more democratic control, again, not of the content on the internet, but of the engineering of the internet, to make it more civilized and to make sure that good conversation, civil conversation, is favored over anger, at least on the mainstream platforms. And that's something that's technologically possible, and just needs to be thought through a bit more. And the second answer is that we need to begin thinking about what public interest social media might look like. So what is the alternative? I mean, what are the fora, the ways in which there could be mass debate or mass conversation, in which there would be, the algorithms would be favoring good conversation and good interaction, as opposed to fights and divisions and arguments. And there, again, a lot of scientific work has been done on it. A lot of computer scientists and also other kinds of scholars have been looking at this, and there are a lot of small experiments. In our piece, we wrote about an experiment that's been done in Taiwan. Maybe some of you know about this. There are these big public debates that are conducted using an internet platform called Polis. And what Polis does, again, it favors consensus. And so it works a little bit like Twitter in that lots of people can join and they can post things, but the program gradually shows where the areas of consensus lie. And the Taiwanese have used it to debate questions like, should there be Uber allowed in Taiwan? Because the taxi drivers don't like it, but some of their customers do like it. And they've held national debates in which they've come to some consensus, and they've created, they've used it in a real way. And this has been tried in a number of places. Maybe some of you on the call are from countries where this has been done. I mean, Brazil is one where there've been experiments like this, and there are a few others. So beginning to think about how we could have better online conversations, how we could do it at scale. So it's not just, the 90 or 100 of us here on this call, but it's a much bigger operation. This is another form of thinking, and that may also eventually need, depending on the country, some kind of government intervention or tax on Facebook to pay for it if it's going to be a non-commercial space. But just if we could rethink of the internet, instead of having it be totally dominated by 4 or 5 companies, think of it like as if it were a city. In a city, you wouldn't like it if all the spaces were dominated, but there was nothing but shopping malls and shops, right? There have to be other things too. There have to be public parks and museums and other kinds of spaces. And if we could have more spaces online where there was better conversation and people had reasons to join it, then that at least the beginning of the creation of alternatives is the other big idea. That, again, then this is not at all a fantasy. It's something that people are actually working on and experimenting with, and there are some examples in the article that I'll post in a second.
Amazing. So first of all, I see 2 hands raised. Please post it in the chat and we will read it later. So this is, we don't want to check the technology and where it works with participants. Another question, which may be a very good introduction for you, to conclude and me to translate to ban comes from Dean Baratta. Curious if you see this new form of autocracy as more or less susceptible to traditional forms of protests and activism.
The new autocracies as opposed to new. So the difference between modern autocracies, at least the more sophisticated ones, I'm not talking about all of them, is that many of them have thought about and anticipated the challenge from democratic protest in a way that their predecessors haven't. So the Russian government has identified democratic language and democratic protests as the main threat to its own power. And so the Kremlin spends a lot of time thinking about, first, how to use messaging to undermine the idea of democracy, how to use messaging to undermine the attractiveness of European democracies or of American democracy, how to undermine those democracies because it's now in their interests for other democracies to fail. And then, of course, how to use a combination of police brutality, legal change, and so on to make sure that protest doesn't happen. And so I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize. There are some exceptions out there, but very often we're now talking about societies where autocratic societies who have anticipated protest, have thought a lot about how to stop it, or in the case of China, have seek to control the national conversation in a way that protest either remains in very small groups, or disappears. So I'm not saying that they. It's not so much that they are. It's not that there can't be any democratic protest. It's just that these regimes are much more sophisticated in their communications, in the way they approach the problem than previous autocracies. I mean, it's not the. And what's key, I think, and this is, particularly true of both Russia and China, is that neither of them seeks to dominate the entire space. So these are not old-fashioned totalitarian regimes. And their propaganda is also not merely about how great we are. It's not like the old Soviet Union saying we're great, and that
it's actually nothing is great.
But that propaganda was always open to reality check. Look how much grain we've sown this year in the Soviet Union, and everybody could see that there wasn't any grain. And so, the gap between propaganda and reality was always the main problem. And now there's a much different technique is used. So now the modern Russia doesn't really care if anyone admires Russia. They don't even really mind that much whether Russians admire Russia. That's not how the propaganda works. Instead, the propaganda is designed to create uncertainty, apathy, and nihilism. So it's more like it was described what Steve Bannon used, the expression of fire hose of lies. So constant repetitive lies so that people are disoriented, so that they don't know what, and also so that they see no alternatives. So they know Putin is in power and they don't see anything else.
Yeah.
They don't see any alternatives. And the propaganda is much more sophisticated. I'm sure others are going to speak about this as well. And the techniques to control it are different than they used to be. That doesn't mean they can't be beaten, but it is different.
Okay, and so thank you for giving us such a great overview of one side of the chessboard, which is where the governments are and where the internet are, and I see hands and questions. We're going to address it once we do the full circle. Now we are going to the second side of the coin, and flipping the coin with Ben Press, taking a look at how movements have evolved and how protests have evolved in a previous period. Ben, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Sergey. It's great to be with you. And Anne, thank you for those extraordinarily insightful remarks. I'm going to go ahead here and share a brief presentation we put together based on some data and research that we performed on protests at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Look, Anne has outlined so well the fact that democracy worldwide is in dire straits. But I want to put as a counterpoint to that, the fact that citizens are not just rolling over and blindly accepting what their governments are doing as a sort of given. Instead, activists worldwide have ignited the largest protest wave in human history, challenging democratic and authoritarian regimes alike. Let's see here. As the data on rising global protests makes clear, protest means something different in 2020 than it did in, say, 1980. something is clearly undergirding the rise of a new, more central role for protests in political life and for more protests full stop. As you can see in this chart here, not even the coronavirus pandemic, which everybody thought would be a major killer of protests worldwide, could stop the rising tide of protests. Instead, 2020 was a record-setting year in the world of political protests, surpassing even 2019's levels in terms of the number and diversity of protests worldwide. This, I would argue, is because there is a sea change going on in the nature of power. In an age where power has become diffuse, so too has the form of protests. Where mass movements were once driven by the hubs of civic life, like unions, political parties, civic groups, and religious organizations, they are now increasingly being driven by nameless and faceless groups of activists. Leaderlessness, though, is not just a protest typology. It's a set of explicit strategies that organizers and activists are adopting to better achieve their objectives, and a core reason, I would argue, for why we're seeing the largest protest wave in history. Now, there are 4 key dimensions to leaderless protest movements. First and foremost, they have a spontaneous and discrete trigger. Leaderless protest movements emerge spontaneously and are sparked by any different kind of event, but the common thread is that they're always unpredictable. This can be anything from a natural disaster or an extrajudicial killing to a stolen election or a subsidy reduction. Though these triggers can be very hard to predict from the outside, activists capitalize on the relationship between the event and broader frustrations within society. Whether it was, for example, Mohamed Bouazizi lighting himself on fire in Tunisia in 2011, or Breonna Taylor and George Floyd being murdered in the United States in 2020, these events spark a wave of anger that encompasses a set of issues well beyond the initial trigger. Second, and this is pretty much implied in the name, they lack core visible leaders. But I want to flag something here. Although a protest may be labeled as leaderless, that doesn't mean that there isn't leadership involved. Rather, leadership is more collective and horizontal. It is depersonalized. Organizers are using alternative structures from anonymous online forums to open air assemblies to determine objectives and strategies. Building on the Polis example that Anne was talking about, organizers in Hong Kong put together an encrypted app where they could come on and debate strategies in a form similar to Reddit. So technology is really coming in here in an important way. Yet because these protests lack a coherent and cohesive leadership, they often also lack an actionable, consensus-driven agenda. And so dissent and disagreement can lead to vague goals and divergent strategies. Third, these protests are highly decentralized. Because they don't rely on core leaders, the leaderless model creates space for anybody and everybody to take ownership. Anyone can now see a protest breaking out in another city, take inspiration from it, and say, hey, come out to the town square at noon tomorrow for a protest. This decentralization allows for a new level of inclusivity. Leaderless protests are, for example, much more local, reaching into communities that might never have participated in protest movements before, including, very importantly, a deep well of new participants outside of politically engaged big cities. Now, let me also state here that this lack of ownership of a core group can open space for malign actors to infiltrate these groups and claim to be acting on their behalf when in reality they're not. But that can be used as a real vulnerability and tactic to undermine these movements. And finally, these protests spread rapidly through the information space. They spread so rapidly through these information networks because the nature of information sharing, as Anne has said, is changing. Organizers now rely on larger, more structured forums. Think of social media, the internet, messaging channels like WhatsApp, and unstructured informal conversations between people. This is part of the reason why you're seeing in many autocracies that internet shutdowns are not killing protest movements. Because when the internet gets shut down, people just walk over to their neighbor's house and say, hey, we're still protesting. You want to come join us? This is not something that's a kind of catch-all effective tactic. And to the earlier question, why autocrats really do have a hard time responding to these protests. And I hope we can come back to that question after in the kind of discussion portion. Now, social media is especially important to this since these platforms have made reaction times virtually immediate and can help sustain conversations, allowing for an open exchange of ideas and updates across geographic divides. Now, I would argue that the rise of this model is no accident. Two complementary dynamics are fueling its spread. First, as we've discussed, they are highly inclusive. But secondly, and again, touching on the point that Anne closed on, these leaderless protests are hard to repress, very hard to repress. And activists around the world are emulating this model, especially in autocracies. Agency in leaderless movements is so diffuse that detaining a few people, or even a few thousand, or shutting down the internet, can't curb the movement. The only other repression option, aside from mass detention, is kinetic force, shooting the protesters. But that's really costly for autocrats. So they're left with two bad options from their perspective: either repress and risk further inciting protest, or spur defections from the regime and the security sector, or reform and risk destabilizing the entire authoritarian power structure. Now, this conundrum really is a key decision point for many autocracies and the make or break point of whether or not an anti-authoritarian movement is going to succeed. So to close, more people are taking to the streets than ever before, and they're demanding more of their governments than ever before. Now, I love this picture. This comes from our protest tracker work at the Carnegie Endowment. And it shows all of the countries that have faced significant anti-government protests just since 2017. We've tracked nearly 300, a rate of one breaking out somewhere in the world roughly every 4 days. As protesters find new strategies and models, and governments find new ways to push back, the form of protest is likely to change, whether towards leaderless models or otherwise. But as you can see here, with the spread of protests across the world, a truly global political phenomenon, the underlying dynamic is not changing. Protests are becoming a part of political life in a way they never have before. So when we think about the future of protest movement, sure, it's a question of form, but it's also a question of function. As protests become more integrated into the landscape, these movements are likely to become a durable, if not permanent, fixture of our politics. And as a result, it's very hard to see when this protest wave will break. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, for this amazing presentation and insight. And we have a string of questions. I have two which are kind of quite similar, and I'm going to try to compile them.
Sure.
One of them.
But before, should I stop sharing the screen? Should I go back to
that? Would be great.
Okay, there we go.
So the first one is which form of protest? This is like the zillion-dollar question that you and me are debating it all the time. So are we going to witness less protests in the future led by individuals and charismatic leaders or mainstream organizations? That's one question, if this is a trend. And then another one is which form of protest is more effective in terms of what you achieve in terms of goals? A leaderless one or a protest led by a certain organization or individual. So the question is where the trend goes and which one shows more effectiveness, which model?
Well, thanks for that question. I mean, I think that if I had the answer to the first question, I would be a very rich man, as Sergio said, because it is the $1 million question. Look, I mean, what I can do is kind of tell you the way that protests have evolved in the past, but I can't extrapolate into the future. I don't think that 15 years ago, any observer could have predicted the way in which the leaderless model would have come to be the central dominant strain of global protest. The question, though, does suggest, as I mentioned, some of the vulnerabilities in the model, which is that, without a kind of central organizing group or individual, you do lack the kind of cohesive agenda that can bring about political change. When you have a truly leaderless movement, you often have an agendaless movement, which it can succeed in toppling a dictator or toppling a government. But building a government or a regime out of that becomes very, very difficult because you don't have a set of consensus principles. Sergio and I talked a little bit about this in a previous speaking engagement we did, which is that there is a kind of fusion model, which brings together a core hub of organizers, but adopts principles of leaderlessness. I think Sudan is an excellent example of this, where the Sudanese Professionals Association, which is an organization of semi-clandestine labor organizations, adopted principles of leaderlessness and depersonalized its own leadership structure to form a consensus agenda and bring people together. But it also harnessed the power of inclusivity and leaderlessness to bring more people into the street, especially in a very, very oppressive authoritarian regime. So that's what I would say is a potential future model going forward. In terms of efficacy, which was the second question, as I recall, is that right, Sergey? Yeah, efficacy. I mean, look, I think it's hard to say. The data would suggest that it's not so much the form that determines efficacy, but rather it's the size, scope, and nature of the protests. If protests in an authoritarian state, for example, are focused on a very discrete issue, say, we don't like this government's environmental policies, the autocratic regime is often willing to compromise on those kinds of things. But when you get a fully anti-authoritarian movement that brings millions of people into the street in a campaign of broad-based pressure against autocracy as a political system, that is something where the regime can't necessarily fix its way out of that problem. And so when you can get those kinds of mass broad-based protests, the regime really doesn't have an outlet aside from reform, which can often lead to collapse. So I would say that those movements over the past 5 to 10 years in autocracies have been the most effective.
This is all great, and I think it fits nicely into both what Anne said and what we're going to explore from the rest of Academy. And I have one very short question. We have three or four more from the audience that I will serve for the end. I love this way of thinking about the ownership. And I think the importance of ownership is very important. The movement know that by being a part of the movement, know that by working with movements worldwide. When you say ownership, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that why people protest is often a very personal decision, rooted in deep personal frustrations with an experience that one has had with a government, with a given social system. And when you're following someone else, you often, find a shared collective vision that you feel like you belong to. But in a leaderless model where you can take ownership, you in some way are the one putting that agenda forward. As an organizer putting together a Black Lives Matter protest in a small town in rural Kentucky, for example, you are doing that rooted in local circumstances that are very personal to you. And they're very personal to the people around you. And that model of inclusion, that model of ownership, drives a new level of participation and engagement that is rooted much more in the personal and in the proximate than it is in some distant vision that an organizer who shares some broad experience with you, that they might have put forward. But when you're able to own that in a space that is your own, I think that personal experience becomes much more powerful and important to both you and the people around you.
This is amazing answer, Ben. Thanks for this. And we have a few questions for you. We'll collect them on the end. Tina, welcome. And of course, the last Ben sentence reminds you of what you were hearing from us over and over. People are selfish. They will join and sacrifice things that they find important for themselves personally. And this is how you start by creating successful movements. I know you wrote the most comprehensive book about the model of the Serbian movement. I know you can talk about the many places in the world by living in Chile in the time of Pinochet. But my question is more Americanocentric. Should we be worried what's happening in the US with the polarization? Should we be hopeful for the new leadership? I mean, can you give us a little bit of the American angle to this story?
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's a privilege to be here on this fantastic panel. And I've learned so much just from listening to Anne and Ben. We're all very lucky to have these folks as speakers. So I'm going to talk about the United States and how in a country with very strong democratic institutions, we have gotten into this place where democracy is really under threat. And the first thing I want to say, I'm going to make a couple of brief points. One is that the pandemic probably helped us because it is very, very likely that without Trump's mishandling of the pandemic, he would have won. So I think one of the many, there's lots of reasons, obviously, that Biden is president now, but one of them is Trump's handling of the pandemic. So that I think has been very useful. So one of the things that's going on in the United States, and we saw that on the January 6th coup attempt, is that events in our democracy that have been previously seen as ceremonial or consensus process are now being treated by many people as opportunities for partisan gain. January 6th was an uprising that was geared to what was normally a pro forma ceremonial congressional vote to endorse the results of the Electoral College. And yet the anti-democracy folks saw that as a way to actually overturn those election results. That's a new thought in American democracy. We have not in the past had that. And this is now going on, I think, very worrisomely at the state level. There have been bills introduced by Republican legislatures in 41 different states to give state legislatures more power over elections. And they've been enacted so far in 14 states, and there are undoubtedly more to come. And part of it is restrictions on voting and ways of making it more difficult for Democrats to vote. And because ethnic minorities are largely Democratic, this is focused on communities of color. But what is actually more worrisome than restrictions on voting is alterations in how votes are counted. And there are many bills that have made vote counting much more subject to partisan intervention. For example, giving legislatures more power over local election boards. In some of the bills allow state legislatures to overturn Electoral College votes, the will of the people. So these are extremely, extremely worrisome. And many of them are subtle enough that they might just pass muster in the courts. The Supreme Court has been pretty good on election issues. They turned down Trump's appeals with no comment. They did not accept that case. It was unanimous. And but some of these bills are subtle enough that they actually might pass muster in the courts, and that's very worrisome. So how is it that the United States has gotten into this cult of personality and this dominance by the big lie, which was that the election was stolen from Donald Trump, when actually it was probably the most successful and cleanest election we've ever had? And obviously one of the reasons is the filter bubble. I mean, we are living in a world where people not only have their own opinions, they have their own set of facts, and people live in two different universes. And one of the things that's important to realize is that if you are in that bubble, if you have made your choice that you get your news from social media, from like-minded folks sharing articles that they like, and from media like Fox News, it is entirely rational to believe that Trump was cheated out of a second term, because that is everything you're seeing. You are not seeing information to the contrary. And so that's one important issue. These people are not necessarily crazy. They are believing what media tells them. And I want to talk a little bit about the role of journalism in these processes. And it's not just journalism where we would consider them to be dishonest. It's also people who consider themselves to be good journalists and honest journalists. The problem is that the more media you consume, and that includes the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Evening News, the quote mainstream media, the more media you consume, the less accurate is your perception of what the other side thinks. So if it's actually, if you ask liberals to characterize what conservatives think and conservatives to characterize what liberals think, journalism is actually highly misleading. And one of the reasons is the way journalism proceeds is we tend to choose the most extreme voices on both sides, highlight them both, call it balance. But what we're doing is giving people an extremely distorted view of the world, we make it seem like, as journalists, we make it seem like we're more polarized than we really are, and that in turn increases polarization. So mainstream media is also very much to blame for this. We are not giving an accurate view of what the other side thinks. It's actually true that there are many issues on which the right and left agree in America, and we are not as polarized as people think we are, but you would not get that impression from reading and listening and watching media. The other thing is I want to talk about what Anne talked about, the feeling of loss. And I think this is hugely important. The divisions in the United States right now are not about policy. Who cares about policy anymore? I mean, we're not talking about healthcare and economics and all that. We're talking about culture and largely race. This, I think, was largely a backlash against the Obama presidency. And what Trump had brought to his followers was the sense of, you have been cheated out of your dominance. And of course, when you are used to ruling, when you're used to being dominant, equality feels like oppression. And in the United States, it is largely white males who have less than a college education, who are feeling that the rug has been pulled out from under them. The world is changing and we don't know what's going on. And in other countries, it's a rural versus urban thing in many ways. Race may not play as much of a role, but there is still this culture clash. And it is still more about my feelings that I am not being respected anymore, that my views are not taken into account, that my way of life is disappearing. And I think that is the big problem here. It is not necessarily, the polarization comes from this. And I think one answer to that is changing journalism so we can actually listen to each other, so we can talk about what is going on both sides, so people feel respected and reflected by the news. Right now they don't, because of this caricature that journalism tends to present. So I think that this feeling of loss, this feeling of my culture is disappearing, it's psychological. And I think a large part of solving it comes from changing what we consider to be journalism, what we consider to be news. So those are problems that are leading in the United States to a real danger for democracy. Traditionally in the United States, the president's party loses the midterm elections. It is likely that the Democrats will lose the House and the Senate. It's possible that this year is different because Trump is not here anymore and his influence has been greatly curtailed by being off social media. So I'd love to hear what Anne and Ben think about this, but I think there is some possibility that there will be, that there's hope there. But I think the way to bet is at the moment that there will be a big downslide in democracy in the United States.
Just to put one more question before we move on, you have several in the chat as well, which are mostly how you solve this and what kind of journalism and dialogue we need. I have a external point of view. Are we witnessing America back for the table when it comes to the global struggle of democracy now with the new president? Obviously, we had absence and accusations that actually, Trump liked Kim Jong-un and he would like to be like Putin or whatever, but certainly the new administration seems to be more engaging in the issues of world democracy.
Yes. No, both at home and abroad, I think there is that big difference.
There is a big difference. Okay, so in short, compiling 2 or 3 questions, Tina, what may be the way forward for it in terms of how we do our dialogue, how we do our politics, how we listen to each other when it comes to solving this polarization. I'm very often speaking to my American friends. I say, you need to talk to somebody from Balkans so you can hear why this is a very bad path forward. First, we start talking badly about each other, then we start despising each other. We ended up killing each other. And I mean, this is the way it went in Balkans. So what do you think may be the cure, or what may be the issues that unite people, or what may be the angle that unites people, or what may be the policies or whatever emotions that unite people?
There's a lot of there is a lot of consensus on many issues. For example, conservatives strongly believe that climate change is a man-made problem and we need to do something about it. You would never get that impression from what the media says, but
yeah, but when you read Nate Silver, you see actually 70% of them think it is important.
Yeah, I mean, there's consensus on a lot of issues. The problem is issues don't matter anymore. It's more like a sports team. If you're a Yankees fan, there is nothing that could happen that's going to make you like the Red Sox or root for them. That just will not happen. It's tribalism, and I think respect is the answer. And I think a lot of journalism is designed to make people feel disrespected. People who live, I come from rural Michigan, and my hometown is very red. It's people who used to work at an Oldsmobile plant. Many of them got laid off in the 1980s and have not worked since. And people have been, they used to feel like life was good and life is no longer good. And but more important than that, they feel like the elites look down on them, do not respect them, hold them in contempt. And that, I think, is a solvable problem. And one way to do it, the organization that I co-founded, the Solutions Journalism Network, teaches newsrooms how to report differently on polarizing issues and how to write stories that actually get at people's deeper thoughts and reasons for their beliefs, not just sound bites, and also what people are doing to solve their own problems. So we don't just cover marginalized communities through the lens of stereotype. When the mainstream media goes to the American South, to Alabama, we look for the people with 4 teeth. And we write that story over and over and over again. People who report in communities of color in Chicago, what they're interested in is gun violence, as if nothing else took place. We tend to look at these communities that consider themselves marginalized, through the lens of their worst stereotype. And that makes the polarization problem much worse. And that is changeable, and it is changing.
This is a great answer, and thank you for, as a Top Gun journalist, actually starting the problem solution with the journalism. I think this is a very important point of view. And now everything we spoke, from a global democracy decline to the new era of autocracy, all the way to the new models of movement, polarization and deprives community, they all meet. February the 1st, Burmese coup, one of the most interesting cases that we're witnessing now in the world. Ada, the floor is yours.
Hi, so thanks for the intro and thanks for having me here. Really honored to be here with such esteemed panelists. So I'll just share my screen. Let's see this. Can you guys see this? The screen? Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Great. Okay. So I'm sure that all of you guys have already heard about the coup on February 1st, on the day that the newly elected parliament was supposed to be sworn in. Our president and Aung San Suu Kyi and other members of the NLD party were detained on the pretext that the election had been fraudulent. And this was not the first time it happened. 14 years after we gained independence from the British colonialists, there had been a coup by General Ne Win after he ran the country into the ground. In 1988, there were more uprisings, not unlike that, put down with thousands of protesters shot dead. But since the military had installed a quasi, democratic government in 2011 and we had enjoyed 10 years of a democracy, no one really thought that we would go back into the dark ages. So when it first happened, everyone was shocked. The internet was shut down, mobile data, Wi-Fi, were very spotty. They would shut it down whenever they felt like. You would turn on the TVs and it would be, state-sponsored propaganda that was blasting. And we were misinformed, and we were under the impression that if we didn't cause a huge commotion and we didn't go out onto the streets, that for 3 days or something like that, that the international community, that the UN would intervene. So we were quiet for a few days, but then the first protests kind of broke out. This is Gote's-san in Mandalay, the very first protest. And pretty soon the protests swelled, right? There were hundreds and thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions. And it was a very, I guess, a moving moment. And at first it was a very festive atmosphere. You can see that people were very creative. They had a car breakdown protest. And on the bottom left-hand, you can see that security forces are helping to push down these cars. There are people who are dropping onions on the streets and trying to pick it up and disrupting traffic. So a lot of, very fun, creative protests that were disrupting, normal life and showing that the coup is not normal for us, that we don't accept this. And everyone could participate. You can see their children, families coming out, the LGBTQ community coming out, older people for Disney princess protests. And we use the 3-finger salute as a symbol of our resistance, which is taken from Hunger Games, and that was also used by Untitled in 2014. So all of this was going very well. You can see that there are security forces back there. They were still pretty restrained at this point, but sadly that didn't last very long. So there was a brutal crackdown where they were shooting, first rubber bullets, then live rounds into the crowds. And I think at that point, things really changed. At first, the response was quite mild. They changed their tactics by doing some people-less protests, but the people were still very brave. They were still out there on the streets. They were still protesting, but there were more creative strategies also used. They used the kind of sexism and the superstitiousness of the military against them by hanging up, under longies, which are clothing that's worn on the under part of the woman, like the lower part. They believe that if a man walked under it, would win any battle. So the one strategy that they keep soldiers from being able to eventually end up because the violence is so bad, and they're likely to. So they're very quick, 10, 15 minutes, you're out on the streets, you run through, you protest, you're done, you're gone before they can ever, security forces can ever appear. Another great example of kind of an inclusive protest campaign that everyone participated in was the pots and pans banging protest. So every night at from 8 p.m. to 8:15, everyone would go out, bang their pots and pans. And you could hear it, around the whole city, and it was just a very powerful protest movement. And of course, there are a lot of different social media campaigns going on. This is one where you're wearing a blue shirt to show your solidarity with prisoners inside insane whose uniforms are blue. And aside from all these, very creative strikes and protest movements, one thing that people are doing is also boycotting and pressuring military businesses and military affiliated businesses. So one great example of that was how Myanmar beer, which was the most popular beer in Myanmar, got pulled from a lot of the shelves. Their sales plunged by 80 to 90%. Their largest brewery has pledged to divest from there. We've also put a lot of pressure on oil and gas companies to stop paying the Ministry of Oil and Gas enterprises, as money that goes to them would be going to the military to use it to buy arms and ammunitions to further oppress the people. And a lot of social punishment campaigns were carried out against family members of the military and their business associates. And of course, there is the famous CDM, the civil disobedience movement, which I think is one of the most effective strategies that we've used so far. The military said that one of the things that they would do for curb the pandemic. So at first it started, doctors walked and said they, do not recognize the authority of the military junta, that they would not be serving. And they were followed by a lot of other civil servants, and thousands of people were walking out. It made the country completely ungovernable. The banking sector was hit very hard. Banks remained closed for 3 months. The economy came to a complete standstill. So basically 90% of national government activities, like businesses couldn't go to process any paperwork. And you can see that there are two people are staying with us. The Buddhist monks, because Myanmar is a predominantly Buddhist country, and they are the moral authority. So here's a picture of, in the silent protest, and then there are also security forces. And right now we're also really focusing on defections of military and police. And so far, this is all that's happened. Almost 900 people have been killed. 6,000 people have been, over 5,000 people have been arrested. But the thing is that these numbers are probably not accurate. There's probably more that's happening, but this is what we know so far, right? So there's a lot of, they try to cut off our communication. They're hijacking our airwaves, raids, arrests. They have taken over the judicial system. So basically the law is whatever they say is violent, crackdowns. And I'm sure that if you go on Twitter, hashtag what's happening in Myanmar, you can see all of this happening. So now the response of the people is that, they have formed active community called People's Defense Forces, the PDF. And a lot of people are starting to believe that violence is the only way to remove the tyranny. And that's actually quite scary because of how they retaliate when you actually go with violence. So some things that I've learned from this is, that we're learning from this is that we have this decentralized leaderless movement, which, as Ben mentioned, is very difficult to stop. And doesn't really matter. Everyone is a leader, and everyone, will continue the. And you can see that's really bringing together a lot of people from different ethnic backgrounds, and the youth are really at the helm of this. The Gen Zs, and most of them are growing up in the last 10 years. They post democratic norms to the world. They have social media, so they've really built up a resistance movement that the military did not expect. And they, the youth, not just Myanmar, all these multi-alliance countries, we think they have a vision for a really inclusive and democratic society. And another thing is that we have a lot of creative tactics and strategies, but long-term, we need more strategic planning and more unity. And we really need to learn from the mistakes of the past, right? So as Ben mentioned, there are, this leaderless movement is great. It's difficult to stop. It's very inclusive, but it's very difficult to form like a coherent strategy and have, one political. We can already see, lots of different groups popping up. There are divisions starting to occur. So I think we really need to remain united, just like in 1988 when, they couldn't form a cohesive kind of political strategy agenda quickly enough. There was a power vacuum that kind of made space for another coup to happen. We need to be careful of these things. And I also think that the protests alone are not enough. And we need to kind of think further, how do we take this one step further, especially because Myanmar is such an ethnically divided country, right? So, what are we going to do once we topple this dictator? I think those are important things that we actually need to start considering now. So yeah, so that's kind of my take on this. And I wasn't, a political activist or anything before, just a normal young professional who's working. And I think this revolution has really created many activists, and we've all come out. And now everyone is a revolutionary, and everyone is going to fight till the end. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Ada. Your voice was breaking along the way, so it seems that Burmese junta finds the way to interrupt with your internet wherever you are. Several questions and quick questions. We all know the coups are very different animals than the oppressive governments, because oppressive governments, at least in name, carry some maybe fake, but still legitimacy. So the way to dismantle the coup throughout the history was always the combination of two things: deny them governability, deny them legitimacy. Seems that movement in Burma was pretty effective in denying governability, at least at home. What you may think may be the way further, how you promote this new unity government, which we can call parallel government in terms of tactic, but it's actually legitimate government because it draws its legitimacy from the election. And most importantly, how do we prevent Burma going Syrian way with this new idea of, oh, a lot of security forces are defecting, let's create them a little bit free Burmese army, free Syrian army, so we can challenge Tatmadaw with the weapons. What do you think about this trend? Is it growing? Is it stopping? What's happening on that side? So parallel institutions and nonviolent discipline.
Definitely, this trend towards violence, it's very clear. It's happening. I'm not really sure at this point if we can stop it. But you know, I doubt that it's going to turn into a completely Syria-like situation just because we don't have anyone. Our neighbors are not going to arm us. So the people, I think, arming will be kind of at a disadvantage in that way, and the military will always have more force than us. So I really think that, you know, we need to hit them where it hurts, which is, you know, which is the economy, right? And kind of having countries around the world put pressure on them and to not recognize them, but to recognize our national unity government. But I'm not sure that, you know, these are, of course, my views. A lot of people are very emotional. They're very angry. They want to do what feels good, which is, you know, you see them coming into your neighborhoods, arresting people, beating up small children, and you want to kind of go out there and fight them. And it's there are a lot of young people, a lot of young men and women who are leading this movement. And what I'm concerned about is that they're all about, you know, they're young, they're energetic, they're all about action. They want to go out and retaliate. They're not really, you know, sitting down and coming up with long-term, you know, coherent strategies and thinking about the long-term consequences of their actions. Yeah. Not that I blame them.
Yeah, this is also a great point about talking about this new stray of autocracies. So from you, I will shift back to Anne and ask Anne. Burma is a great case, and we discussed this. Are we witnessing these? Well, Sudan is yet another case. Are we witnessing that, taking a look at the Burma and the military and how they legalize their business and how they're monopolizing the beer and the cigarettes and the mining? And is this new breed of autocracies, these autocracies INC or junta incorporated, is this also vulnerability? Because now instead of soldiers, you can now target businesses.
Yes, that's a really good point. It's one of the ways in which other ways in which modern autocracy is different from autocracies of the past, in that they are somehow integrated with the international financial system. I mean, we now know the story of how Putin comes to power actually involved him. You know, they stole assets in Russia, then they sold them in the West, then they laundered the money in the West, and then they brought it back. And in other words, the international financial system is kind of, you know, so intertwined with Putinism, just as it's of course intertwined with Shiism or whatever we're calling. I have trouble saying communism in China because it seems to me it's not quite the right word for it anymore. I guess nationalist rule by the Communist Party. But you're absolutely right that creates a possible vulnerability. In other words, these are people who are reliant on Western banking systems, who are very often have money and assets and sometimes family members abroad, who have inside their own countries have investments in particular companies or in properties, and targeting those. In other words, hitting the people themselves might be a way in which you could affect change. I mean, that's certainly how America and Europe now think about sanctions. Sanctions are now very rarely, you know, in the olden days, we would boycott Iraqi oil or something like that. Nowadays, sanctions are they almost always at least try to target them on particular people, on particular companies, on businesses that have connections to the regime. And absolutely, it's something that domestic actors could do as well.
Great question. Then I move from you to Ben. Ben, if we agree that when you take a look at the historic cases, for example, anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, it was actually the combination of domestic non-cooperation and international isolation, which sucked Peter Botta's government dry of the resources to continue apartheid. So he wished to continue, but there were no resources. In terms of protests, how you can really target, if you take a look at these new states, so what are your main targets? What may be interesting place to look?
Do you mean in terms of international actors?
Giving in terms of international actors, but also I'll leave international actors to Tina, and I'll ask you, what if you are a genius behind targeting things in Burma, what would you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that going for the legitimacy of the regime is always going to be something that gets people going. I think, but we've talked about that a little bit. One particularly interesting mobilizing force that we've seen as a really significant protest movement driver in recent years has been corruption. This is a problem that is endemic to all autocracies. There is no autocracy in the world that does not use corruption as a key part of maintaining the integrity of the regime. But this is something that, almost like nothing else, gets people angry. Even supporters of a regime, when they find out that someone or something in the apparatus is involved in corruption, it really gets people mad like nothing else. So I would flag that as a thing that is kind of a unique driving force, kind of totalizing driving force, because it gets everybody upset. That is something that, as I'm sure Anne would talk about more, has been weaponized very heavily, though, by international actors. But conversely, it is one of the things that international actors are targeting heavily through things like Magnitsky sanctions. And the other thing that I would say, and Ada talked about this a little bit, is the regime's brutality and repression. This is another thing that is deeply unpopular. To be seen shooting and beating your own citizens is something that is just viscerally painful for people to see their countrymen men and women being shot at. So that is something that I would flag as well as being a target, saying that this regime is killing its own people, it's corrupt. And that really does strike at the legitimacy question, because if a regime is truly legitimate and democratic, then shooting at one's own people would seem to be kind of counter to that.
This is a great answer. Last question on Burma on this round, but this time pointed at Tina. Tina, with your experience looking at this, what may be the best international approach? Is this what Anne just said? Is this some kind of multi-level democracy? Can US and EU step more in a region there? Why is India so silent? I mean, are we witnessing this awful dilemma between we don't want to poke China or we don't want to lose business interests, so we are going just to look another way where generals are killing people? What's in stake? You're muted.
I think you meant to direct that question to Anne, because it's one that I can't answer.
Okay, Anne.
The question being, what should we do about the kleptocracy, basically?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's not an easy answer, in the sense that there are lots of different things that need to be changed. But first of all, and I think this is a very winnable argument inside the advanced industrial democracies. First of all, we have to end, the internal corruption that makes possible this external corruption. So we need to end money laundering. We need to get rid of tax havens. They can be shut down. There's no kind of law of nature that says that the Cayman Islands have to be a tax haven and that has to be their main form of earning money, and that every other country in the world has to tolerate that. We can make it legal to keep your money in a tax haven. So we can do that. We can also, and this actually, the Biden administration is very interested in this and has begun it, we can begin to beef up our tax authorities and and people who study white-collar crime. Right now, the United States has very weak enforcement on those and not just the United States, actually the UK as well, and others as well, because it's a very difficult form of crime to track and understand. It requires a lot of technical knowledge. It's not something that traditional police forces can do, but beginning to build up the cadre of people who understand it and can fight it. I mean, a lot of these things can be, cut off in very simple ways. So for example, and this is something I've been saying for years, which is that I'm right now in London. And London is a city where the real estate market, the property market, has become kind of like a Swiss bank account. So people can set up these anonymous companies to buy expensive houses. And then nobody knows who owns the house. Sometimes they're lived in, sometimes they're not. A lot of central end London is just empty, some of the best and most beautiful houses in the city. You could just pass a law and, say it's illegal to own a house through an anonymous company. Or you could pass a law and say, if you own residential property in the United Kingdom, you have to pay tax on your worldwide income, for example. And that would, deter people from doing this. And sometimes these things have become people are so habituated to them or so used to them. And of course, the problem, particularly here in London, but also in other places, is that a part of the local domestic elite has also become addicted to these practices and is making money out of it. I mean, in London, it's just, half the Tory party are people, have people who are, who are themselves making money out of these kinds of arrangements. And it's an obvious piece of, it would be popular politics. Nobody likes the idea that Russian oligarchs own half the property in the city. Nobody likes the idea of money laundering. And it would be, I'm actually waiting for a major Western, European American or indeed South American or African political party to take this as an issue and run with it, because I think it would be something that would be very popular. But it's just simply, there's a series of legal changes that vary slightly from country to country in which you could just stop this kind of activity and make it impossible.
So you can make autocracies INC being vulnerable where the money is, because very often this is where their heart is.
You prevent them from exporting money and from using the international financial system. You prevent them from money laundering. It can be done. It would be a structural change, and there would be a price to pay for it, especially in money laundering capitals like London, and to some lesser extent New York and Miami. But it can be done.
Okay, with that notion, first of all, I will ask how grateful we are for you being on this panel and leading this conversation. Of course, it was not idea to give the answer to all of these issues, but obviously we put some light on a trend of the autocratization of the world, of polarization and fake news being cause for a lagging of democracy in previously democratic countries, where we're looking at India or US. We put a little light and agree that despite this wave, the people are actually pretty active in a very different way, different level of leadership, different level of success, but still the wave is there. We explored the role that both good and bad, the new media and internet have on these issues, and we touched a struggle really deep to our heart, which kind of embodies most of everything. I'm so sorry that I didn't have more time to work with Ada on issue of generation. This is really, really interesting thing. We're witnessing the generational thing in Burma now. So that will also be a part of what Tina and Anna highlighted with, active people, passing people, people freaking out, being in 50s, and then the whole new generation of people coming in. But that will also be an issue of our Thursday session when we talk about the environmental movement, probably the youngest demographic membership of any movement happening in the world, and one of the reasons why we all have hope for the future. We got a lot of questions we couldn't answer. We got some questions about the Bitcoin, that's session 4. We got some questions about the other countries, but once again, I would like to say how grateful we are for your participation. Tune in for the session on Thursday. Thank you for being part of the Canvas Summer Academy. And for those of you who asked, and there were many, both PowerPoints and recordings will be able to you, and Canvas team will make sure you get the link to your inbox. Once again, thank you, Ada. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Ben, for for being part of this. This was both interesting and educational, and also thrilling. And thank for more than 110 people who spend their afternoon listening to us instead of doing something more interesting. Have a great day. Hugs from Serbia, and then respectively Washington, New York, London, and Asia. Have a nice day. Thank you for being part of this, and continue the great work, guys.